Hi and welcome to the first video on the cognitive perspective. This is IB Psychology. My name's Linnea Karlberg and I'm an IB 12 student. So what we're going to be talking about is essentially cognitive processing. And what you can see right now is what the IB requires you to know in terms of the models of memory. The Multistore model of memory is what we're going to focus on specifically. So first off, what is cognition? Well, it refers to all mental structures and processes. So internal mental representations and mediating processes that guide behavior. And these cognitive processes then refer to a number of tasks the brain does continuously. And these procedures are in charge of processing all the information we receive from the environment. And one of this is memory. So memory is often understood as a series of mental actions or mental operations that allows us to encode the data we receive from the environment, consolidate, and retrieve it later. And there are many theories regarding memory and how it works. It is very impressive that we can store so much information in our brains. One of these models is developed by Atkinson and Shiffrin in 1968, known as the multi-store model of memory. These researchers divide their overall theory of memory into two distinct dimensions. It's the control processes and the structural components. The control processes are changing phenomena, so not permanent features that the individual controls, which influence how memory is encoded and retrieved. And then there's the structural components. They suggest that information flows through three memory stages, or sometimes referred to as stores, each of which has different capacity and duration. So you can all see this model illustrated here, but we're going to go more into each store, starting with the sensory store. It has unknown capacity of sensory inputs, perhaps unlimited, but it only stores them for a fraction of a second. And the information here enters a relevant store, so tactile, visual, audio, etc., and it's then encoded in that matter. We have all of the senses here, by the way, for your memory. And the information that then is attended to is transferred for short-term memory. But if information isn't noticed, it's lost immediately to decay. So yeah, short-term memory. It has the capacity of 7 plus minus items or chunks of information, and the duration is about 30 seconds. This information is encoded phonetically or visually, and if the information is rehearsed, it is transferred to long-term memory. If not, it's lost due to displacement or decay. Some information can actually be cycled or kept in STM through maintenance rehearsal. So I thought this was a really cute comic down here in the corner that can help you remember how short-term memory works. Okay, so long-term memory. Once again, the capacity is unknown. Is it unlimited? How much information can we have inside our brains? And here, the information is processed semantically through meaning. You have to place value into what you learn. Collaborative rehearsal is what keeps information in long-term memory. Memory loss can happen due to interference, which is when memories integrate with one another until they become indistinguishable, or decay, which is how memories fade with time, or retrieval failure. So memory missing stimulus, cue, or context. Now it's important that we evaluate what we learn because that's one of the command terms that can come up in the exam. So let's look at some of the strengths of this model. Well, like I said, it's from 1968, so it is a very pioneering model. It inspired decades of research into memory, and there has become many models after this one. So yeah, really inspiring, I must say. It is also very easy to understand since it is a simple linear process. And it can also explain the tip of the tongue phenomenon. That's displacement in short-term memory due to retrieval failure. However, it has a lot of flaws since we've learned a lot since 1968 in terms of memory. it takes a very reductionist view. So it does this complex phenomenon and try to put it into simpler components, but a lot of detail is likely lost along the way. It doesn't explain some stuff. For instance, incidental learning. When people learn something without any rehearsal, that happens sometimes. How does that work? And long-term memory is much more complex than this bottomless pit of rehearsed memories that is being portrayed as here in this model. It explains memory as something that happens to people without any human agency or control on their parts. Like individuals are passive receptacles of memory, but more it's active and an individual can shape it, which we'll talk more on when we talk about schema theory. It also does not include a lot of the components of long-term memory, like explicit memory, somatic memory, and episodic memory, and implicit memory. It just sees it as long-term memory. It also suggests that memory is linear. And like I talked about a little prior here, schema theory challenges this, and we'll go more into what that is in our next video. Another thing is that it suggests that short-term memory and long-term memory are unitary or self-contained, but there must be some clear interaction between the two. One of the studies that does not support long-term memory is a case study into KF, who could usually not remember more than 2 numbers, but could remember a 10-word sequence in fewer trials than normal controls. And according to this model, intact short-term memory is required to transfer information to the long-term memory. So essentially it has problems with ecological validity. It's too simple to account for the many ways memory is encoded. Memory doesn't neatly flow from sensory to short-term to long-term. And a lot of people say that the studies supporting the Multistore model, they're not realistic. So Glancer and Kunitz, for example, their studies are based on memories of single words, but memory has multiple verbal inputs, and sometimes it happens simultaneously. So yeah, like I said, it doesn't take into account all the parts of long-term memory. Some that's been suggested is, for instance, explicit memory, which is declarative. It requires some level of conscious thoughts. And this is, of course, then divided into two: somatic memory, which is facts, events, accumulated knowledge, and episodic memory, which is personal experiences, usually remembered as events. And then we have the implicit memory that's not in conscious awareness, but it's still shaping behavior as it's very procedural. Um, yes, the multi-store model memory doesn't address this at all. So here we have 2 studies then in support of this theory. So first it's Corkin in 1997, who looked into a case study of HM. This study supports the functioning of STM and LTM, short-term and long-term memory, as independent mechanisms operating in sequence, as this patient had an integrated amnesia evidence severe malfunctioning of the short-term memory. So any new memories could not be encoded into the long-term, which is exactly what MSM is all about. Then we have Wilson, who did a case study into Clive Waring, and his hippocampus was completely destroyed through a herpes virus. He could remember that he loved his wife, but not that he had children. He could still play instruments, but every 2 minutes he would forget and wake up once more. So his short-term storage was normal, but his long-term storage was completely disrupted. And here suggested then that amnesia results from the breakdown of the encoding sequence from short-term to long-term memory. Another empirical evidence used in support here is by Glancer and Kunitz in 1966. They looked into the existence of short-term memory and long-term memory as 2 separate stores. So this is several experiments, and I'm going to talk about 2 of them. Experiment 1 consists of words presented at either 3 or 2 seconds rate. And the participants who were presented with words at 3-second rate, they were more likely to remember the first words of the list than participants presented with the words at 2-second rate. And this is because, according to the researchers, they were able to rehearse the first words more, therefore enabling them to enter long-term memory. And in the second experiment, participants were presented word lists and directly afterwards asked to count out loud. And participants were asked to count out loud for 30 seconds remember fewer of the last words on the list to the participants that were asked to count out loud for 10 seconds. And this is according to a researcher because they were unable to retain the words in short-term memory as they were displaced by the counting out loud step. So essentially, this study provides evidence for the existence of short-term memory and long-term memory as two separate memory stores. So this supports the multi-store model of memory, simple design that's easily replicable. If you want to make it as an IA, for instance, and it had multiple iterations of the experiment that resulted in mutually supporting the results. However, this was a laboratory experiment, so it lacks a degree of ecological validity discussed prior, and the mundane realism of this task could be questioned as it's not an everyday activity. This is not really how we use memory. Maybe it's more realistic to talk about memorizing stuff for a test, like the IB psychology exams. And that is all I have to tell you about the multi-store model of memory. Thank you.